much, Ollie. Thank you for the warm welcome to Traditional Country, and I'd also like to acknowledge my co-author, Leslie Head, who is in Sweden at the moment and couldn't be here today. Although it's often part of a Western perception that weeds have no history in Aboriginal culture, weed work has been part of the colonial experience of Aboriginal people from very early on. In the period of 1914 to 1915, the acting curator of the Darwin Botanical Gardens described the labour arrangements with the Darwin prison located next door. Aboriginal prisoners carried out a variety of work: general upkeep, planting and clearing of noxious weeds. Here, 5 Aboriginal prisoners and a supervisor stand in front of piles of cleared lantana, a major activity in the gardens in the following decades. Too often, colonialism is seen as a single event rather than an ongoing process. In Northern Australia, colonialism is something of an unfinished project. Euro-Australia still struggles for possession of the land with a frontier mentality, whether in pastoralism, mining or tourism. The colonial legacy is present in the dire state of Indigenous life expectancy and a range of other social indicators. Today I explore the entanglement of 2 kinds of invasive lives in Northern Australia: invasive plants and the enduring life of the unfinished colonial project, a kind of invasive life itself, which continues to have implications for Aboriginal people. I want to highlight today that Indigenous invasive plant management can risk becoming a continued form of dispossession, as well as having good potential outcomes. Behind me is Senior Malak Ranger Rob, standing in a seasonally flooded wetland of the Northern Territory, and 3 weeds of national significance: Salvinia, Mimosa and Olive Hymenacne. As Rob described to us, there are 4 components of the work of his ranger group: weeds, ferals, fire and cultural maintenance. But most of his time is spent managing weeds. As a result of land rights and native title legislation over the last few decades, Indigenous people in Northern Australia have formal title to extensive areas of land. This brings both traditional and legislated responsibility for management of complex issues, including biodiversity conservation, fire, carbon credits, invasive species management, as well as custodianship. In the short term today, I focus on just 2 aspects of part of a larger research project where we've been researching Indigenous invasive plant management in Northern Australia. First, the historical legacy, and second, the labour issues associated with weed management. A specific example of this historical legacy is Ngurubur. It's been established in the Kimberley of northwestern Australia since at least 1974. Today, Ngurubur remains an extensive problem along these rivers of the Ord and the Fitzroy, although the effectiveness of the quarantine zone and intensive management program that was established at the time has been questioned. It did have long-term ramifications for Aboriginal people in 2 significant ways. First, the quarantine area, through its fences, gates and fines, was a mechanism for dispossession and reduced access to traditional lands, particularly along river frontages. Part of the quarantine area was lifted in 1999 in response to intense pressure from recreational fishers and tourism operators, even though Aboriginal people had expressed ongoing concerns for a number of decades prior. Second, the chemical spraying with poisons like Agent Orange, which did not succeed in eradicating Ngurubur, have had long-term effects on the health of Aboriginal people involved and their families, and this was recently brought to public attention on national television. There are continuing health and wellbeing issues for Aboriginal people and others related to chemical spraying. The rangers we spoke to noted that even 40 years later, in some places, weed management programs struggle to find Aboriginal staff, willing to take on this work. Now, many things have changed since the 1970s, and issues of chemical risk are not only Indigenous concerns. However, it has been noted elsewhere in North America, for example, that many of those who faced increased exposure to chemical herbicides used for invasive species management are members of racial minorities, and this clearly is a risk that has not gone away. Secondly, today I just want to briefly touch on the labour characteristics of Indigenous invasive plant management. There are many kinds of labour involved in managing invasive plants, and many kinds of labour involved in staying on country, writing funding applications, reporting on grants, establishing and running community education programs, negotiating with adjacent landholders, to name just a few. The positives include training and employment for young people. However, and many of those are young men. However, the vast majority of jobs are short-term and they are dependent on project-based funding. Aboriginal capacity to be involved and carry out this work is highly variable and has been identified as one of the primary barriers to effective weed management. These include the small sizes of many Aboriginal groups, the generational succession issues, traditional owners moving away, and so on. People's domestic circumstances, cultural obligations have also been identified. And a further issue is gender. Women represent only 10% of people involved in working on country activities nationally. So finding ways to increase this percentage, for example, would build capacity significantly. In addition, there are issues specific to weed work, and these include species identification, skills training, certification, training for fire safety, OH&S training, vehicular and machinery maintenance, and so on. We heard about shortages of senior staff who would be able to manage a workforce and so on. Sorry, I'll just skip too far forward. So some of this training is provided under registered programs and contributes to career development, but it also presents a dilemma, as Rob here explains, to the actual weed work itself. Rob described a situation last year in which his ranger group was taken away a week on, a week off for 2 months, and when they came back to look at the state of the mimosa they were managing, it had shot up from small seedlings to something the size of a small tree. There are also important reasons to contest this relentless lack of this narrative of a lack of capacity, and instead, like others, we suggest that it's often the natural resource management institutions and government of the dominant system that lack intercultural capacity. So our future work next year will be exploring this issue in relation to weed work. In conclusion, the heritage of invasive plants is indisputably part of colonialism, and its many expressions, including not only the physical introduction of new plant species, but also the land use changes and the new economies that attend to the dispossession of traditional owners, are part of that. So our perspective on the colonial legacy is twofold. On the one hand, Indigenous people and weeds have been tied together in complex ways for a long time, and on the other, the specifics of those relationships and that assemblage are changing. Much of this change has been for the better in terms of Indigenous claims to land being recognised, but it is not unproblematically so. Indigenous communities are still overwhelmingly operating from a position of disadvantage. Indigenous invasive plant management has the potential to help address the significant management challenges of invasive plant species with strategies that draw upon deep Indigenous knowledge of country and how it changes. All the indications are that people will have to learn to live with more invasive lives rather than less in the future. And this will require a diversity of ways of learning to live with and kill invasive species. Invasive plant management in Northern Australia is heavily dependent on Aboriginal labour, but there is little systematic recognition of the important role these communities are undertaking. On the contrary, in many current expressions, the legacy of colonialism is evident in ongoing disadvantage. Maximising the potential will require ongoing attention to ensure that it is not just another form of dispossession. Thank you very much for your time.